I think we probably should start. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sam Jacoby. I'm the director of the Projective Cities program here. And first of all, I would really like to welcome all the speakers and, of course, thank them for actually having showed up or still having promised to show up. And of course, I also have to thank the AAPC program that has made this event possible. This is hopefully one of the first events in a more annual series of events that we will hold as part of the program to discuss problems, questions, issues that relate to what we're doing or what we're doing within the Projective Cities program. Perhaps why are we doing a symposium on type and typology that really relates back to, oops, I shouldn't have done that, right? There we go. That really relates back to sort of a long-term teaching that goes back sort of 6-7 years and was started with my teaching colleague Christopher Lee in diploma school here, which led us later on to start this program. And one of the questions we were really interested in was the question of type and typology. And of course, as I called this type versus typology, and of course, you probably might have already noticed that's kind of a contradiction in itself, right? I mean, there is no such thing, I believe, the type versus typology. But of course, it's something we hopefully will discuss and clarify today as well. I think what was already written also in the synopsis that you've seen is one of the things, of course, that contextualizes this discourse is the 18th century, when there was a deliberate turn away from ideas of imitation or truth to nature towards concepts of abstraction and, of course, objectivity. And out of these kind of questions emerged a new kind of knowledge and also practices in different disciplines, which then in architecture resulted in the early 19th century in theories of type, but also design methods based on typology, which were complementary concepts through which architecture, as both a modern form of knowledge and a knowledge of form, was to be consolidated. In terms of architecture and instrumentality, therefore, type and typology can be considered unique as disciplinary frames through which broader socio-political, cultural, formal problems, etc., can be posed. Right? So that's kind of the basis or the background for this event today. And of course, we hope that the discussions that will take place today will kind of elicit a new interest in the topic, but also clarify what it actually still means for today's discourse. And I believe that this new discourse differs substantially from previous ones, and especially the ones which were really defined in the 1960s to 1980s in the neo-rationalist debate, by entering the discussion through questions of the diagram. And whereas in the recent past, typology has been primarily understood in relation to a normative and static practice, and at best considered as a renewal through updated norms, I think the new discourse challenges these kind of historiographical limitations. And to rethink the agency of type and typology, or to conceptualize how they relate back to practice and theories and the knowledge of architecture is sort of the aim or the hope of today's event. And I will maybe just very briefly, for those who haven't seen the list, it'll be in 3 sessions. There's a morning session with 3 presentations. I will start off with the first one, then one by Larry Barth and Hyungmin, followed by a short panel discussion. Then we have a lunch break, and then session 2, which will be started by Philip Stadman, followed by Tasha Finney and Christopher Lee. And then again, we will have a panel discussion. And then because of the regular Friday lecture series by Mark Cousins, we'll have to break at 5 o'clock, and then we'll restart for a final session at 6:30, where Raphael Monnier will speak, and then we will have a final concluding roundtable discussion. We will print out some of these, so if any doubt, I mean, you can check out if you need to break in between. Okay, so what I really want to talk about is the difference between typal and typological reasoning, or in fact, try to clarify a little bit if there are differences or complementarities between the concepts of type and typology. When referring to type in architecture, we commonly assume a discussion of building types, their use and form, or appropriate organization. Consequently, typology is often defined as simply the study and classification of these building types and their morphologies. In the following, I will attempt to outline differences but also complementarities between type and typology and between typal and typological reasoning by relating them to a distinction between the history and theory of architecture and the notions of invention, disposition, and style. While the terms and the clarification are central to an explanation of typal and typological reasoning, what is at stake is not historiographical rigor, but how, for example, by rethinking the relationship of type to the diagram, these historiographical limitations become obsolete and new possibilities to clarify and reconceptualize the practice, pedagogy, and disciplinary knowledge of architecture emerge. Since the 19th century, the concept of type, construed as an idea or model, encouraged continuous transformations of its meaning, making an agreement on a definition beyond that of a formal taxonomy seem impossible. The various interpretations propose architecture as defined by normative received forms or as rational and positive science whose progress depends on the morphological evolution of forms. To perhaps embrace these contradictions, I argue that all theories concerned with type are foremost epistemological and discursive arguments by which a synthesis of the form of architecture and the city is conceptualized and diagrammatically organized. Through this type of reasoning, form acquires multi-layered historical, social, cultural, and symbolic dimensions, limited by, but importantly also in excess of, material reality. The spatial and material organization of reality, in turn, is the concern of typological reasoning. While our understanding of type largely relies on practices and theories emerging with so-called neo-rationalism in the 1960s, when considerations of typology, morphology, and history were widely employed to study problems of architectural design, but also subsequent historiographical reviews that by the mid-1980s judged this discourse as failed, the use of type in architecture originated in the early 19th century. Historiography recognizes two central figures: the French academics Antoine Chrysostome Quatremer de Quincy, the permanent secretary of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, and Jean-Nicolas Louis Durand, professor of architecture at the École Polytechnique. To these, an overlooked third protagonist, the German architect Gottfried Semper, must be added, but also a precursor, Julien David Leroy, in order to fully appreciate how, through the disciplinary questions raised by the notions of type and the implicit problem of historicity, a modern understanding of architecture was instigated and lastingly defined. The three inaugural theories by Quatremer, Durand, and Semper, despite the different conceptions and use of type, share reasoning of form only made possible by the means of abstraction. The historicist interpretations of form advance arguments for the autonomy of architecture and its knowledge through different formal languages. In the process, mimetic imitation is replaced by mimetic, conceptual, and symbolic abstraction, but also a diagrammatic reduction, and stresses the complementarities between type and diagram, abstraction and translation, and idea and model. History and theory of architecture. Responding to a rising empiricism, the French 17th and 18th century normative discourse on architecture intended to modernize the discipline and profession by establishing a rational canon able to consolidate existing theory and practice. However, employing empirical methodologies, advancing scientific archaeology, examining contemporary case studies, and focusing on constructional problems, the idea of a classical authority was soon undermined and compelled a historicist relativism tasked to explain the relevance of classical precedents to continuing practice. Thus, Leroy, in the ruins of the most beautiful monuments of Greece, introduced in 1758 for the first time a division between the history and theory of architecture, accepting an irreversible conflict between representation and reason that required a rethinking of the historical framework. His distinction was underpinned by the argument that the historicalness of the architectural artifact is characterized by its cultural and geographical context and essential to understand architecture, but distinct from, yet complementary to, its theory, by which he meant the principles that, equally determined by cultural milieu and geographic situation, define the practice. Arising from this tension between history and theory, architecture is simultaneously a general and specific object affected by and experienced in the past and present. Ever since Leroy, it is therefore no longer possible to argue for architectural forms or practices without considering the historicity, without acknowledging the effects of history on the becoming and definition of disciplinary knowledge. Yet today, we regularly separate history and theory from practice in order to free problems of form from the burden of historicity. To synthesize a metaphysical general and a formal specific in architecture, Leroy accepted the architectural object as historical in its origin, but also part of a formal development that can be typologically compared through abstraction. He speculated that architectural form belongs to a continuous development of what he considered underlying primitive original ideas, which due to the persistence could be deemed ahistorical, with typological diagrams enabling their analysis and deployment in practice when they become identified as a historical object within a specific context. This offers a conceptual and material, or historical and theoretical explanation of form, with Leroy suggesting both a separation of typal and typological reasoning, but also a synthesis of these different forms of knowledge. Leroy's analytical strategy is explicit in the history of the disposition and different forms that the Christians gave to the temple since the reign of Constantine the Great to our own day of 1764, when summarizing the evolution of churches in a comparative plate that juxtaposes the plans in sections. Evocative of a Linnaean taxonomy, the matrix provides the arguments adopted by all later claims to an evolution of architectural form, a process of methodical reduction and a comparative diagrammatic explanation. While the graphical comparison is not original, Leroy differs from his predecessors as his interest is not in size or stylistic detail or chronology, but formal relations creating a progressive sequence of transformation. Published to demonstrate the authority of Jacques-Germain Soufflot's design of Sainte-Geneviève over previous church designs, the building is depicted in the center of the drawing as a synthesis of three distinct typological developments by comparing the organizational and structural diagrams of the cross-shaped plan, the parallel rows of freestanding columns in a basilica, and the dome. And of course, the drawing goes the other way around. I mean, I had to rotate it. Invention. Quatremer, in his winning submission for the Prix Caylus in 1785, closely followed his juror Leroy's position by claiming that the tripartite origins of architecture, the cave hut and tent, developed sequentially but in parallel within different cultures. However, in a substantially edited version of this memoir for publication in De l'Architecture Égyptienne in 1803, he radically overturned his earlier conclusions by proposing now common but multiple origins without any developmental connection, and by comparing architectural origins no longer to a naturally formed but artificial language. This emphasized the process of intellection through socialization and enculturation, and defined architecture and its knowledge as a product of specific socio-cultural appropriation that independently developed in different societies. It also implied a shift from a linear progression of typological models to an organic system of architectural types. Quatremer's changing description of origin is partially explained by his appointment in 1787 as editor of the first French architectural dictionary, the Encyclopédie Méthodique Architecture. This required him to integrate architecture with the system of the fine arts, a group Denis Diderot had promoted it to from Charles Bateau's beautifying arts. Acknowledging the existing discourse, the problem of imitation as a conventional framework to discuss artistic production and invention became instrumental to Quatremer's new epistemology. Prior to him, Johann Joachim Winckelmann's modern art history and critical art theory became only conceivable with, first, his challenge of imitative principles. One's creativity was not solely measured in classical terms as a skillfulness to represent nature, but judged as an abstraction of nature. And second, by his adoption of Leroy's contextual reading of artworks and their taxonomic comparison, on which his periodization and historiographical clarification relied. Nevertheless, Quatremer faced a double challenge: to firmly establish architecture as an imitative fine art, but also to deconstruct its means of imitation. And of course, the problem only arises because a fine art is defined at that point in time as an art that imitates. Remaining in an art historical debate, he consequently defined architectural imitation through the concepts of the ideal, resemblance, pleasure, convention, and invention, making the previous problem of origins obsolete. He concluded this only in an essay on the nature, the end, and the means of imitation in fine arts of 1823, proposing imitation and invention as a form of intellectual abstraction requiring the recomposition of reality in a vision or artifact that is socio-culturally historical, yet conceptually ahistorical. This understood the arts as a form of typal reasoning, as the production was less a formal than a cultural representation that, although practically limited by the material means of each art, was principally only constrained by the social utility. Developing Winckelmann's art historical thesis, Quatremer considered imitation not aesthetically but, quote, abstractly, that is, under a general and theoretical and not a limited and practical point of view, unquote, as a theory, therefore, that generalizes ideas. Non-mimetic qualities, those emerging from an abstract language like architecture and rhetoric, thus became exemplary to his redefinition of imitation. Type represented to him a paradigm, pattern, and absolute standard, and signified the capacity to name and define the otherwise unknown in a world of appearances. This knowledge, so Quatremer, is achieved by an imitative resemblance as a translation of an idea into an abstract and engaging artifact. It, quote, compels us to see one object in another, unquote, and is always necessarily partial, but presents a general fictitious image or model that is, quote, produced with and by means of elements distinct from the elements of that object. Accomplishing a generalization into generating types, this abstraction is able to overcome the Platonic impossibility of imitation to obtain real knowledge through Kantian purposiveness of nature, by obtaining a higher knowledge beyond the remits of appearances and representation. This incompleteness of representation, for that reason, becomes desirable, and the possibility transpose a typal idea into a typological model. With the work of art conceptually unconstrained by form, an imitative resemblance embodying what Quatremer calls the, quote, non-imitative character and simplicity of the original type, unquote, what becomes fundamental is the principle of an abstract existence, of a nature very far removed from the principle of identity. Having developed in the essay on imitation a system of the arts based on abstract or primordial types against which material objects are judged, Quatremer applied this to architecture in his entry of type in the third volume of the Encyclopédie Méthodique Architecture in 1825. The synonymity of the notions of image and idea, and ideal as an adjective of idea, is, as he points out in the essay on imitation, apparent from the etymological roots, with idea deriving from the Greek eidos and eidolon, denoting respectively a conceptual type or Platonic form and a physical apparition. Therefore, under the rubric type, Quatremer famously writes that, quote, the word type presents less the image of the thing to copy or imitate completely than the idea of an element which must itself serve as a rule for the model, unquote. While models have apparent rules, type represents a non-representative, non-prescriptive higher idea, motive, and intention. Type is organizational and the model structural. Thus, typological models represent the implementation, formal articulation of the speculative embodied in non-material typal ideas. Contemplating the problem of invention, Quatermain concludes that, quote, the orderly art of building was born from a pre-existing seed. Everything must have an antecedent. Nothing whatsoever comes from nothing, and this cannot but apply to all human inventions, unquote. These seeds are both formal precedents and elementary principles, which as small human inventions are obligated to sentiment and taste. And type is therefore, quote, like a sort of nucleus around which are assembled and with which are consequently coordinated all the developments and the variations of form to which the object was susceptible. Disposition. While Quatermain developed a type of reasoning in which conceptual abstraction is the basis of invention, to Durand's preceding examination of genres, a typological reasoning remained essential, although he never used the term type or typology himself. He defined architecture in functionalist terms as the formal disposition of parts, and his comparison of abstracted historical forms made the reduction of formal diagrams the means of analysis and development in architecture. Accompanying his teaching at the École Polytechnique, Durand published the collection in parallel of edifices of all kinds, ancient and modern, in 1799 to 1801, and which later included an essay on the general history of architecture by Jacques-Julien Legrand. The typodiagrammatic analysis of history by Leroy was formative to his students' Durand understanding of functionalism. Yet, methodologically, Durand owed equally to a comparative classification by the zoologist Georges Cuvier. This allegiance was in no uncertain terms proclaimed by Legrand's essay, stating that similarly, through the structural and formal principles of architecture, a, quote, natural history of architecture might be created, unquote. Corresponding to Cuvier's comparative taxonomies, in which history was abstracted to formal and functional structures that lent themselves to scientific analysis, to which physiognomic development could be reconstructed but also explained, the ambition of the collection in parallel was to transform architectural history likewise into a scientific instrument of architecture. At once neutral and technical, drawing provided to Durand the necessary means to analyze formal development. With history defined as rational, the effects of style and character of a building were eliminated as secondary, culturally specific phenomena. In their place, organizational and morphological relations and an increase of formal complexity became the material verification of historical progress. The logic of the collection parallel was developed in Durand's précis of the lectures on architecture given at the École Polytechnique of 1802-05, that devised a design method simple to follow and instruct. As the précis asserts, its method applies to the design of any building. Durand's architectural course accordingly is, quote, a return to first principles of the art, that is to say, to the pursuit of certain ideas that are few numbers but general in application, and from which all the particular ideas would necessarily derive, outlining a safe and rapid way to compose and execute buildings of all kinds in all places and at all times. Durand proposes a generic method, entirely defined by utility, through which the burden of style in history is apparently overcome, as traditional architectural orders and proportions are only recognized as part of a historicized disciplinary knowledge. The means of architecture to achieve utility are fitness for purpose, purpose and an economy of means. Fitness derives from solidity, the right use of materials, salubrity, the right choice of site and building exposure, and commodity, the right disposition of the building, while economy develops from symmetry, regularity, and simplicity. Durand's method requires planar dispositions, with the horizontal plan informing the vertical section. The disposition of a building and its elements derives from regular grids and axes, a grid of parallel interaxes determined by the structural distance of two columns, according to which the building elements are distributed. The structural building elements are differentiated by subdividing the initial grid and omitting, adding, or offsetting an axis. This creates infinite part-to-part to part-to-whole combinations of building elements and results in a mutation of the partie, as plate 20 demonstrates. The fitness of the final composition, so Durand, nonetheless is also influenced by its response to the contextual requirements of, quote, places, persons, sites, costs, and so on. Following the plan, sections are developed through comparable vertical combinations, and from the plan and sections, the elevations derive. The limitation of this method, however, is revealed by the indeterminacy between plan to section and elevation. As this plate shows, the plan-based process cannot logically translate into vertical planes without conventions, providing a scale and mass, and is inescapably depend on a stylistic choice, which of course in this case is neoclassical, or neoclassicism. The didactic elevations, and by implication the party, in fact derive not from the process of disposition, but a precedent, as the invention of a dome is unexplained by transformations of a planar grid. This is evident in plate 21, entitled Procedure to be followed in the composition of any project, which is really this one, right? Which was added to the 1813 edition of the Nouveau Précis and reordered by Leandro Madrazo to highlight the logical sequence. In the Précis, disposition equals a differentiation of precedence, which Durand admits to at the very end, quote, to combine the different elements, then to proceed to the different parts of buildings, and from those parts to the whole, such is the natural sequence that should be observed in learning to compose. By contrast, when you come to compose yourself, you must begin with the whole, proceed to the parts, and finish with the details. This method is consequently didactic, and not a method of design, but a method of analysis. Despite Durand's repeated mention of construction and material, it reveals his main interest, the pedagogical architectural project. By proposing a diagrammatic function of precedence, Durand is able to deploy received forms not as normative, but contingent to design practice. Thereby, the abstraction of architectural form is premised on formal progression and assumes an accumulation of complexity, one, however, defined by the limits of an existing taxonomy of work and knowledge. Borrowing from the sciences, Durand understands new architectural knowledge as arising from a structural and diagrammatic understanding of relationships and no longer just from aesthetic representation or problem. This approach provides architectural disposition with a degree of autonomy and is by Durand intrinsically linked to a social agenda. The desire and strive for utility is what forms society, and, quote, architecture and architects are made for society, unquote. It is this generative and social agenda, in addition to the attempt of formulating a formal grammar able to respond to the exigencies of modern society, by which Durand anticipates the program, but also failure of the modern movement, and also process-based design practices that disassociate a typological formal thinking from a typal argument. Style. Precisely the relationship between typological materiality and typal conception motivated Semper's work, which developed a synthesis between an abstract and socio-cultural concept of type and what he deemed the driving yet subordinated typological, material, and technical transformation of art forms. Studying with Jakob Ignaz Hittorf in the 1820s in Paris, Semper became familiar with Durand's didactic teaching, but also the debate on polychromy instigated by Quatremère's The Olympian Jupiter of 1814. Inspired by the problem of color, Semper concludes his own archaeological studies in the preliminary remarks on polychrome architecture of 1834 with the observation that the arts specific to the cultural and political context formally transformed artistic traditions but upheld elemental typal motives in idea. His search for the origins of architecture and its typal motives was first articulated in a draft for a comparative theory of building around the 1840s and summarized in the 4 elements of architecture of 1851. They consolidated his dressing thesis or Bekleidungstheorie and theory of material transformation, his Stoffwechsel theory, through which he identified his 4 elements of architecture, the hearth, roof, enclosure, and substructure, and their correspondence to the technical arts, specifically ceramics, carpentry, textiles, and masonry. Essentially theories of invention, he explained the creative process as a modification of persistent artistic motives through stylistic formal changes. Semper concluded his comparative theory of style, the technical arts and architecture, in his London writings, including the Four Elements of Architecture, Science, Industry, and Art of 1852, Theory of Formal Beauty, which was written in the 1850s, and a series of lectures in London from 1853 to 1854. In his lecture, An Outline for a System of a Comparative Theory of Style in 1853, Semper proposes a compromise between a material and psychological reading of culture and its history, while formulating a theory of building based on a comparative analysis of elemental types. Stylistic variations are, according to Semper, the practical means of necessary utilitarian material transformations in the becoming of form by disintegrating formal traditions and reveal in the abstraction a symbolic and cultural context. Style, in this way, becomes the artistic means to define the material model and to make art relevant to society while preserving an enduring non-material typal motive. Semper in the lecture also posits that architecture, like modern sciences, should adopt a systematic ordering of knowledge through classification. Recalling his visits to the zoo in Paris as a student, then directed by Frédéric Cuvier, who's a brother of the other one, Semper argues that a comparative and organic analysis could equally become a method to understand the forms and formations of the industrial arts, quote. They are like those of nature, connected together by some few fundamental ideas which have their simplest expressions in types. But these normal forms have given and give rise to an infinite number of varieties by development and combination according to the exigencies of their specialities, according to the gradual progress in invention. Will it not be important to trace out some of those types of the artistical forms and to follow them in a gradual progress from step to step up to the highest development? A method analogous to that which Baron Cuvier followed, applied to the arts and especially to architecture, would at least contribute towards getting a clear insight over its whole province, and perhaps also it would form the base of a doctrine of style, and a sort of topic or method how to invent, which may guide us to find out the natural way of invention. Similar to Quatermain, Semper believes that elemental types provide the key to an artistic theory of invention, and borrowing from Cuvier, he proposes that a comparison of material and physical formations provides the basis of a methodological theory and a doctrine of style. This comparative theory, so Semper, was anticipated by Durand's collection Parallels, but his specialization separated architecture from its origins, the practical arts and aesthetics, and resulted in what he called a lifeless schematism, disregarding that the, quote, characters of the different architectural styles were clearly expressed in certain characteristic forms of the earliest industrial arts, unquote. Whereas earlier studies of origins focused on a primitive hut, Semper finds its defining notion of utility already realized in technical skills and production, but also in ornamentation. With the industrial art giving birth to architecture, the effects of style are in practical terms defined in all works of art by, quote, observing the limits which are contained in and defined by the task and problem in question, as well as by the accessories which modify the solution of it in every case, unquote. While style is important for necessary typological transformations, certain sociocultural typal ideas persevere. For example, Semper's main thesis of dressing and architecture explains the technical process of material transformation when the spatial coverings and enclosures of wall and ceiling evolve from temporary textile screens into permanent and solid stone walls. Throughout these material and formal transformation, the typal motive of textile decoration is maintained, not in resemblance, but an idea. The intrinsic relationship between a typal idea and its typological transformation, so Semper, is etymologically manifest in the roots of the German words Wand, which means wall, and Gewand, which means dress, but also supported by archaeological evidence providing a developmental link between Egyptian, Assyrian, and Greek architecture and their use of polychromy. This definition of style essentially conforms to one already provided by Quatremère, quote, "Style meant that which is least material, that is a conception of ideas and the art of developing them according to a certain order," unquote. Without contradicting Quatremère, Semper, however, emphasizes the interrelationship between type and style. As he argues, over time and with a succession of material transposition, the effects of type and style become hybridized, and, while retaining a principal artistic idea, the stylistic articulation often changes. Typal ideas are therefore expressed in different materials, and one material has to accommodate different conditions of style. Semper's system of the practical arts is premised on principles of organic comparison and differs from established chronological or geographical classification by considering developmental connections beyond the restrictions of linear time and space. He groups the practical arts according to shared types, which are of course coating, ceramics, timber construction, and stone construction or stereotomy, although recognizing that the formation of most artifacts is transitional or like architecture, a combination of these. Semper's doctrine of style explains how the transposition of a generic idea into a specific formal model can be conceived by conflating Quatremère's metaphysical and cultural idealism with Durand's deterministic and utilitarian materialism. This develops an idea of type as a compromise of typal and typological reasoning and consolidates the ambitions of theory and practice, with invention and disposition both a precondition and an outcome. Semper provides an example of how type accommodates continuous authorial reinterpretations and material transformations. He recognizes the potential of typological comparison to make form available to rigorous analyses, but also its potential shortcoming, limiting invention to mere formal progression. Quatremère, Durand, and Semper's theories are consistent with the first three principles of transformative composition in rhetoric. Quatremère's theory of type articulates the first and indispensable canon of invention by establishing a systematic architectural theory of invention that defines the disciplinary means and principles by which coherent arguments are generated in practice. Durand's methodology of design, in turn, is based on a second canon of arrangement or disposition, which follows once an argument or idea is strategized by invention. Arrangement manages the relative and iterative ordering of the part of the whole and organizes an argument into an effective discourse, stating, outlining, and providing proof for a given case or problem. Finally, Semper's doctrine relates to the canon of style by defining the appropriate and effective modes to express ideas. Whereas invention determines what is articulated, style articulates how it is communicated. The three inaugural theories consider the problem of historicity in the architectural work and propose a resolution for practice through abstraction, conceptually, diagrammatically, and materially. The mobilization of history profoundly changed disciplinary knowledge and revealed type as only partially or conditional autonomous. At the moment when, through the transposition of type to a model, disciplinary knowledge is challenged, transformed, and enriched. Prompted by an 18th century transformation of practice and systematization of theory, architecture arose as a modern discipline with its own specific knowledge, whereby the advent of the notion of type in architecture in the early 19th century was closely related to a pervasive obsession with origins that inspired fundamental advances in archaeology, art history, anthropology, etymology, grammatology, zoology, and so on. What this, however, reveals is that despite the specific knowledge they produce, the notions of type and typology are unspecific to architecture and depend on an interdisciplinarity of methodologies through which knowledge is obtained. But more importantly, the instrumentalization of type and typology in architecture discloses that architecture's disciplinary knowledge is in its conception didactic, and that its theory and practice is indivisible and equally a sociocultural and political as well as a material and spatial construct. The eventual demise of type in the 20th century encouraged a turn to diagrams that promise a new rationality but arguably merely re-originated architectural form by repressing history, representation, and spatial specificity. Yet, as Leroy already knew, all architectural practices of diagramming can be considered to rely on type forms or have scope for typological production. The diagrammatic function in architecture ultimately depends on a typological abstraction, an abstraction of form that considers history, context, and culture in its discursive arguments, but also disciplinary limits. Fundamental to the typodiagrammatic function is the premise that architecture does not just exist as a specific object, but as a generic possibility of objects. Therefore, its purpose is to limit and define the possibilities of the architectural object by structuring a projective and typal idea through the use of models without providing a finite formal representation. By depending on conventions, inventions are deemed principled, and by having an organic structure, multiple manifestations become possible. Although diagrams are instrumental to arrange and convey relationships, as the inaugural theories of type reveal, diagrams are only intermediaries between a conceptual thinking associated with types and the articulation of material models. And this is, of course, in regards to architecture. What diagrams contribute to the tension between conceptual types and schematic models is the replacement of dialectic opposition with possible synthesis. Thus, the eventual singularity of architecture emerges as the formation and clarification of a discursive typal idea transposed through the diagram to one of its possible material manifestations. With the introduction of diagrams, the interchange between type and model becomes a syntactic communication that is neither autonomous nor invents a new syntax. By abstracting common organizational and structural diagrams, type can be analyzed and projected and present, on the one hand, practice-driven formal solutions that are unstable and receptive to transformation, and on the other, represent a material and socio-cultural knowledge. Type and typology and the utilization of diagrams are therefore important disciplinary means to meaningfully conceptualize and analyze form. Although formative to the historical discourse of architecture, types do not require historical continuity, as Semper understood, but are defined by performative consistency and historicity through which they resist expiry and affect change. Despite the implicit autonomy, types are an integral part of the physical, material, socio-political, symbolic, cultural, and historical fabric and conception of our cities, and consequently only momentarily autonomous. Therefore, typal and typological reasoning is never simply oriented towards the past, but directed towards the present and future. While the problems of type and historicity have defined the modern reasoning of architecture, this was precisely not to establish static norms, but to advance continuing practice and knowledge. As Semper insisted, artistic progress, while evolved from past traditions, is only possible when traditions are disintegrated by contemporary culture. Thank you.
Well, for the guys that are just arriving, we're having 3 sessions, and at the end of each, we are having questions. So I would like to introduce the next presentation of Lawrence Barth. Lawrence is professor in the Housing and Urbanism program at the AA. His professional practice and core research interests bring their architecture onto the terrain of contemporary urban strategy. Mr. Barth has also lectured in the graduate school's landscape urbanism program, developing the political and strategic component of its curriculum, and in 2004 he initiated the formation of a sustained research program in architectural urbanism at the PhD level. Mr. Barth works independently as a consultant urbanist for cities, design practices, and research institutes. He has collaborated with diverse architects and landscape architects on large-scale urban projects and has assumed the lead role in overseeing a multidisciplinary refinement on the central district within the One North Master Plan for a next-generation innovation environment in Singapore. He has published widely in architecture and sociology, and is a frequently invited lecturer and a critic on the role of architecture and landscape in contemporary urban process. He participates in an international research network of the ground of global megacities and the urban transformations associated with the knowledge economy. He is a member of the governing board of the International Urban Development Association and member of the UK's Academy of Urbanism, and on the advisory panel of MIT KE, a European research network on the sustainable intensification of industrial territories. So let's welcome Lawrence Barth.
Well, after that introduction, I guess you might forgive me for sort of explaining what some of my confusions are. There's a little bit too much going on, I suppose. What I'm, as we've just been hearing, I'm interested in the way in which type and urbanism come together. And I'm interested in it particularly because I feel like we have to understand a bit about type in order to plan effectively. But it turns out that the more we look at that, the more confusing the problems become. And so, in fact, I want to begin by drawing our attention to Robin Evans. And Robin Evans had a very nice quote that opened up his Figures, Doors, and Passages essay, where he said, "Ordinary things contain the greatest mysteries." And I think one of the challenges that we have, in a way, in urbanism is trying to figure out how to bridge the gap between the very ordinary with which we tend to plan and the hopes that we will do something very ambitious when we create plans for very large parts of cities. Now, what was, I think, very interesting about the way in which Robin Evans proceeded, and some of my students have come in, we've just been talking about this lately. I can think of no other writer who so perfectly captures, in a very fluid way, a diagrammatic sense of what is at the heart of architectural change. And I'm really looking forward, Hyungmin Pai, to hearing further what you have to say about that topic. In fact, in a previous iteration of some of this work together with Sam Jacoby and Chris Lee, I tried to make a similar argument that type and diagram are intimately related and in fact indissociable, although different. Now, one of the things that I think is very interesting about Robin Evans' account of the trajectory over several centuries of the form and organization of our typical house is that we can see both the tremendous ambition bubbling away in associative practices, and we can also see a kind of resistance going on in a material world, resistance in an architecture. And it seems to me that the combination of type and diagram kind of capture both things. Now, in that previous essay, I called attention to Alan Colquhoun's way of approaching the displacement of concepts in Corbusier. And I think it's, for me, an interesting way of trying to understand a relationship between type and change and the possibility of ambition, in that we can see that however independent or autonomous Corbusier's thinking was, it was working on something where we already felt that there was a material form which indexed practices that were very deeply rooted. Now, I don't want to say, in fact, that this is somehow the social in general. In fact, what I would more like to indicate is that these things are discursively formed in a way that is quite conflictual oftentimes. There's no I personally think there's no such thing as society in general. I'm a bit of a Foucauldian in that there seems to be a number of intriguing discourses that jostle with one another and yet have great force. Now, if Corbusier was working, as Colquhoun tells us, to overturn some of the ways in which we would understand the elements and the organization of architecture, he was always careful to link the present and the past. He was always careful to tie together our understanding of how architecture had come to us with a certain amount of force, together with an idea that we could easily, in a sense, rethink aspects of an architecture and propose alternatives on the basis of subtle displacements within an architectural mode of reasoning. Now, he rarely, I think, in a way, made any particular effort to address discourses in their particularity. Instead, I think he tended to discuss a kind of proliferation of effects, and then sometimes kind of diagram them in this way. But I don't really know him to have had a very strong inclination to get involved in disputes on the particularities of housing policy. He was more interested, in a sense, in the possibility of living differently and describing how living differently might affect the way in which we think of an architecture. I think these things are subtly different but very important. And so the way in which he begins to describe through an architecture a different possible way of living, it seems to me, do not in a way match up quite so directly with what might be a discourse on housing or a discourse on urban strategy. In fact, when he comes to show us an image like this, which indicate for us the real potential of the 5 points, where you might be forgiven for being almost let down. That is the idea that we could have the separation from one another of elements and organs and structure, and that they could all be thought about independently of one another with no particular purpose, in a sense, I think becomes clear in an image like this. And yet, we all know the great effects that the transformation of the field through the 5 points has worked. Now, I want to touch on a few other aspects to this question of ambition. If on the one hand, we have a sense that in order to be effective as architects and urbanists, we need to have a very strong ambition. And in some sense, type seems to work against that. We seem always, in a way, to be looking backward when we think of type. And yet, if we can think of it in terms of the way in which Corbusier encouraged us to displace the concepts that are at the heart of type, then we can start to make that transition. That's one aspect of ambition. Now, in Alan Colquhoun's essay on the superblock, I think we encounter another sort of problem in ambition. And in that essay, he says that when we come into the 20th century, or late 19th, but mostly into the 20th, we reach a condition in which we overturn the traditional way of understanding the way in which we would have ambition about major buildings, civic buildings, those that in a sense seem to define our commonality as members of a republic, citizens, or participants in a grand project. So that we seem to be able to have great ambition about. Consequently, we think of the dome, the palace, the Rathaus as being the places where we would invest architectural ambition. The rest of it, that's just the grid. It's just the everyday stuff. And in that, we have no reason to think of great ambition. Now, I think the secondary and perhaps more oftenly acknowledged source of a supposed lack of ambition on things like housing or offices is that we tend to think that those things belong for their determination to the merely interested, the technical. That's something that is, in a way, always predetermined by commercial interest, private interest, in a sense doesn't belong to a wider ambition. And so, we look at these things and they're very just everyday. And we expect, in a sense, that this is an everyday world that should not be the subject of that great ambition. And instead, we seem to want to say that ambition should be located here, where we can make a positive statement about a collective form, or here, in the way in which the introduction of a dramatic new form in the Paris landscape offers something particular and special. Now, I'd like to switch here to, in fact, overturn this idea, but to do it via Colin Rowe's essay on the Chicago frame. In that, he begins to develop a difference between the Chicago frame as it was begun by people like Louis Sullivan and a far more interesting pathway that was opened up by Frank Lloyd Wright, in which structure and plan were thought about very closely together. And I think in a way Colin Rowe doesn't really take that essay to an interesting conclusion, but it's a very interesting opening. Now, I don't like the conclusion because it seems to me that kind of fizzles out on the question of a larger social ambition as a kind of totality. But I think he opens up something very interesting in starting to explore the role that Frank Lloyd Wright might have in thinking differently. Now, I think that's also something that's kind of taken up by Jacques Lucan in his book Composition, Non-Composition. Now, in that book, we can see that Frank Lloyd Wright begins to have a quite interesting role in allowing us to think about a very open, convex rather than concave understanding of space, in which we start to think about walls rather than just a structural frame as having a particular kind of relationship to the development of an open space, which will nevertheless create a series of interrelationships amongst things that are not so much rooms and in a sense defined as single pieces, but is always thought about in relation to one another on a diagonal, always opening up multiple readings of a composite space. Now, if we begin to juxtapose that idea with another that I think Rem Koolhaas starts to bring out, the problem of the relationship between a mere repetition of self-similar floors and, on the other hand, the idea that floors can be interestingly differentiated as you start to move up through a building. And I think we can start to see now that we're in the presence of a kind of interesting problem field around the relationship between structure, articulation of differences in a tall building, in which what we really want to do is to have an open and a not merely repetitive understanding of spaces as contributing to a wider urban fabric. So if we can kind of summarize it like that, it's the problem not only of the tall building, but of the everyday practice of office life, living in the city, living and working in the city. And so it's here then that I want to turn and spend a bit of time talking about the Seattle Public Library. I've been hinting with my students, I guess, for quite a while that I think there's a tendency to want to, in fact, go ahead and tie together genre and type and say, well, after all, it's a library. So what do we expect? Of course, we can invest some effort in the in ambition in thinking about what a collective form like the library might be. But I think what I would like to do instead is to talk about it in terms of a unity of space and structure, perhaps not so elegant as Frank Lloyd Wright, but intriguing nonetheless, but also to begin to link it to questions of the contemporary workspace and the transformation in the way in which an associative principle is at work, in work, and also the way in which we might look at this as an element within the city. If the traditional library was constrained in a sense by the problem of light and books, of course it meant that the source of light had to be moved up the wall and to protect a kind of space for space for books. And then, of course, a sufficient amount of light had to be brought into the space by creating relatively high windows above a wall that contained the storage for books. Now, to that extent, then, if we think about all the sorts of things that go on in a library, from checkout to the possibility of performances and concerts, and this particular rotunda on the right is a scene often of concerts at the University of California, Los Angeles Library, where I worked for many years as an undergraduate. So I had a particular affection for this building. And I think I often sat in that chair where this woman is, as one of the few places where you could kind of read quietly and comfortably. But it was an unusual experience in that library, most of which was dark and down in the bowels of the stacks. Now, if you think about the way in which this library works, the only time you get any sense of an outside or of the possibility of reconnecting to an urban world is, in fact, when you've left the library. There's no chance of having an experience of the city from within the library. That is, in a sense, given by the nature of the type and its intersection with the genre. Now, the Seattle Public Library is absolutely and fundamentally different in almost every respect, and yet seems to be precisely in keeping with how we think, work, engage with materials, read, look on the web, check out books, engage with others, live in the city, in ways really quite different than that library I fell in love with at UCLA. So when one comes in, one notices immediately the vastness, openness of the space, the really quite different patterns of articulation of the floors, the possibility of remarkable views both inside and out, the recognition that today fundamentally we acquire information off digital media, which is best accessed in a slightly darkened space rather than the brightly lit space of northern light where we would like to read. And we begin to think, we can see here that it is working on the basis that there is a depth to the floor plate and an openness to the volume that is really fundamentally different than the traditional library. Now, this is made possible by a particular relationship to structure as well. So what's really quite intriguing about this building is not only the spaces themselves, but what isn't there. So in these spaces, there is not a forest of columns. And in the connection of the platforms, unlike Cedric Price's diagram for the Fun Palace, there's not a tangle of trusses. There's only a few. So the platforms are held together by columns, trussed only minimally, and the open spaces are freed from columns by being separated from the platforms, and the overall thing is held in tension by a glass and steel facade system that actually takes most of the load for solving the problems of earthquake forces. And so when one looks at the overall structure, all of it is working together, a skin in tension, a decision about where columns will be located and where they will be absent, opening up particular possibilities of collective environments that seem to speak very closely to how we want to engage in both an urban world, an urban learning world, and also a kind of workspace. At the same time, there's a possibility of really quite differentiated environments in which one can relax and read. So up at the top, there's a beautiful reading room from which you can look out over the city, while at the bottom there's a cafe where you can engage more closely with others. The quieter rooms at the top seem to have an almost I guess a quite contemplative feel, at least I felt when I was there. And I noticed that other people seemed really decidedly relaxed as they enjoyed these spaces. At the same time, the encounter with an exterior world is dramatic, to say the least. Now, the things that are then being achieved here are something that we might think of as being kind of in keeping with what we imagine the world of talent today is looking for in a kind of work environment. I'll put that term talent in a kind of perhaps scare quotes. I know we don't want to be over-enthusiastic about that. But I also want now to turn to one other aspect of it. If any of you have been to Seattle, you know that the downtown area is just a very straightforward grid. And what's around the building, what's around the Seattle Public Library are office buildings where art gets pushed outside. To the extent that there is some sort of commercial or space that welcomes people from the city inside, there are these little huts sort of at the edge of the towers where you can go in and get a hamburger. But there's nothing that in a way would, you might say, inspire an engagement between the working world and the pattern of engagement in the city. By contrast, this curious form that's been created here in the Seattle Public Library creates a whole series of quite interestingly articulated relationships to that grid, and then it welcomes one into a quite dramatic space. Now, it does so, I think, and this again is drawing on Jacques Lucan's work, it does so by working with a tradition of convex space. There's nothing about it that is related to a quality of enclosure. It spins outward. Every aspect of it makes you feel that you're in the presence of something that is in a quite multi-story, multi-directional way, orienting you through a variety of situations into an outside world, and yet always veiling them just a bit. And Lucan is I think, interesting in drawing connections amongst Mies, Van Doesburg, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Corbusier in rather intriguing ways. And I think that I'm not going to go into all the detail of it here, but I think that there are some interesting parallels then between the things that he is helping us understand about that tradition of reasoning and the problems that it encounters. In a sense, if everything, coming back to this, if everything is infinitely open, how do you prescribe limits? How do you compose? How do you design? And one answer that is posed within the essay is, well, the grid sorts it out for you. Now, in Seattle, that happens to be the case, but I'm not sure it's a reliable kind of strategy. But I want to come back to that in a moment. But I think one of the things that we can see is sort of interesting here over on the right-hand side. I think one can get the sense that also within OMA, there's a kind of questioning of whether the library could also be a workspace. And I want to develop that a little bit further. But perhaps just to remind you, by going back, Frank Lloyd Wright in the Larkin building had a very nice tendency to adapt types that were coming from elsewhere. We might notice the similarities to a library handling of light here in his Larkin building. And then when one released oneself from the problem of the association with natural light and nearness to the window and create a deep plan building with the Johnson wax, of course, then there's another exploration of the possible effects of a new kind of reading and working space. So there is this interesting tradition there. Now, to begin to pull these things together, of course, you all know the building by Hertzberger on the left, and in the center is a plan done by Zaha Hadid's office. I see Patrick here in the audience, so he'll know this well. And in a sense, the problem of beginning to think differently about new kinds of workspace, and how does one begin to give that typological and morphological definition. And on the right is a new building, which seems for all the world to have certain similarities to the Hertzberger building, and yet is just fundamentally different. Now, one of the things that I think we want to bring up here is the way in which our expectations about workspaces are changing. So here we have a very intriguing version of workspace. I mean, I don't know when they work in Korea, but they claim that this is a workspace. But we start to see these kinds of spaces where the spaces look, for all the world like something you would expect to find in a university, or that you would expect to find in a collection of loft living residents of Soho. So when we start to look at the kinds of spaces that those who work at Google and Facebook and others start to inhabit, it looks for all the world like it could be a kind of crossover between domestic life and life in the library. Now, these kinds of patterns then seem to me to suggest that we might want to raise the question whether there would be the possibility of generalizing in some way some of the lessons of the Seattle Public Library for work. Now, part of the reason for that goes back to these kinds of very simple diagrams on team-based work. Now, what's important about that is that actually there is a fundamental shift in the way in which work takes place today. And it's value chains that compete with one another very, very clearly and increasingly so, rather than corporations. Now, I think to a certain extent it's always been a misreading to imagine that companies make very autonomous and sovereign kinds of decisions. There was a very beautiful article written in, I forget whether it was 81 or 83, by a political economist here in London. And the title of the essay was called "The Firm as a Dispersed Social Agency." And essentially the argument is, more or less, the president of the company may think he's in charge, or the CEO, but in fact he's got a marketing division that's doing one thing, an engineering division that's doing another, and the list kind of goes on. That there are several different divisions within a corporation, all of which have to engage with the rules of the discipline in which they work. Now, today, that kind of problem has become even more noticeable in the pattern of very rapid evolution of products under flexible specialization. And it means that companies are always having to collaboratively work with people who are not even in the company. And they're having to find the space in which to gear up, form a team, work productively, and very rapidly make effective and rapid decisions, and then disband the group, and do that over and over and over again. Now, not very many companies can pay for the kind of space that implies. And so one of the things that we're starting to see is the emergence of hub-based spaces. Now, how do we take some of these things that we might start to learn from all of this and apply it to a plan? If we look at this plan this model of a plan for Hoffen City, what's very interesting about it is the way in which a series of things are disposed in order to produce a set of associative effects, in a sense where I think ambition should properly be located. But I think there are some interesting aspects. I like this plan very much, but I think there are some interesting aspects that we could conceivably do differently the next time. Now, some of what is very interesting is you'll notice sort of the third key back as you get close to the, I don't have, there we go. So these buildings right along here, that was the first phase. And they were thought of as simple types. Yeah? Here's our connection back to that kind of, that simple version, that non-ambitious version of type. And so the logic goes, pick 8 or 10 parcels, give guidance that suggests that have the plan dictate that the rules will stipulate that it will be morphologically rather than land use governed. So given that those types could be dwellings or could be offices, we'll just allow anyone to put forward bids as to how to develop the space. And that way we can multiply the number of potential possible stakeholders, and because we keep them small and dumb, there's almost no risk, and as well as a multiplication of interest in the plan. And so as a first phase, it is able to build this up very, very rapidly. Now the associative effect then is one of beginning to create an interest and enthusiasm for the success of the plan. It doesn't do anything particularly dramatic architecturally. When it does, it's pleasant. You know, it looks like a nice place to either live or work. I'd be happy with it. Then if we go on to a second phase, and the second phase is slightly more ambitious, a bit more built area. Interestingly, these are all being built by different developers with different stakeholders, and again, just as rapidly. And so it's working on the basis of saying, look, simple types can create complex effects. At the same time, what was also in the plan was an insistence that where drama and ambition would be located would be in a few signature buildings that would be a concert hall and opera house. And in fact, originally in the plan, the hopes for this building or this site were rather minimal. After all, it was just going to be a work site. But in fact, what's ended up happening is on that site is that Unilever has produced a rather interesting building. Not as interesting as I think it could be, but I want to turn our attention now to some other aspect in the plan, and that's these buildings in here. Whoops, sorry. And what's interesting about the plan is that the plan recognizes that because that's the direct line into the center of the city, and this is where you have to really gain full value, this becomes very complicated. And the plan starts to overstipulate. And suddenly, in a way, we start creating effects that are less interesting than probably the simple aspects of the previous types. At the same time, when it was in proposing the concert hall and insisting on it as a fundamental element to drive ambition and interest in the plan, it focuses on the arts and culture rather than on workspace. And at the same time, workspace itself becomes, for the most part, relatively standard, typical. Now, on the right-hand side, we see the Unilever building, and inside it does at least kind of keep pace with what we're seeing going on these days, an interesting ground level set of amenities that are open to a wider public, breakout spaces above. And so it seems to, in a way, offer something that is more than just average. Now, I'd like to take that idea of the Unilever building and come back over here to London, to the King's Place. The two buildings have something in common. They're good old, let's put a lot of stuff around an atrium building. I think what's kind of interesting is the King's Place has a very interesting level of ambition in one respect, and not much ambition in another. Now, the respect in which it has a great deal of ambition is the way in which it's trying to bring concert space, cultural space, event space together with an office building and tie them all together so that we get an interesting ground floor where people can come and work, and there's a lot that's going on. But when you're there, of course, you have a feeling it's really not a very remarkable space. There's nothing terribly attractive about being there, and we all get bored with it after a while. Now, what I think is kind of interesting is to think about the fact that both the Unilever building and King's Place are precisely what Jacques Lucan would describe as the more closed, concave understanding of space, a very limited set of elements organized around a sort of centrality and looking inward. Whereas if we were to think about some of the potential lessons of the Seattle Public Library, it seems far more in conformity with where working life is going and the way in which it intersects with an urban world. And so what I'm inclined to say then is that if we start to look at a typology, now I know that Raphael Moneo was wanting to say that in fact by the time we get to Mies and Corbusier, we've left type altogether, and this sort of emphasis upon an open space, an open approach to space left behind the adherence to type, if type is understood as a search for the timeless and the origin. Now, I think one of the things that I'm in a way arguing here is that I find it difficult to imagine how we handle the relationship between type, if it is absolutely essential to design. How do we handle the relationship to type if at the same time we try to hold on to an idea of type as a search for origins, and we also want to have it enable us to think productively about the relationship between structure, form, and content? Now, in a sense, it seems to me that something's got to give there. Now, for that reason, I've been inclined to think of a diagrammatic foundation for type that owes nothing to deep historical origins or overall a sort of total history, but instead a more genealogical history, perhaps a more Foucauldian history, and that types are linked together or placed in groups for consideration under the heading, we might say, of a kind of diagram that is filled with intentionality and ambition, very much in a way, almost inadvertently, I think, that the Seattle Public Library was. Thank you very much.
I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Hyungmin. He graduated from the Department of Architecture, the Graduate School of Environment Studies at Seoul National University, where he trained as an architect and urban designer. He received his PhD degree from History, Theory, and Criticism program at MIT. He was twice Fulbright Scholar as a PhD student and also as a visiting scholar at MIT. He is professor at University of Seoul and also visiting scholars at MIT and London Metropolitan University. He has lectured at Harvard, Cornell, and Tongji University. Pai writes in both English and Korean, working on historical and theoretical theories surrounding the architecture, art, and culture of Korea, Asia, and the West. His first book, The Portfolio and Diagram, Architecture, Discourse, and Modernity, has become required material in core course at Harvard University, Cornell University, and also at the AA School. His book also includes Essentials Plan, the key concepts of Korean architecture. And for the Venice Biennale, he was curator for the Korean Pavilion 2008 and the participant in the Common Pavilion Project 2012. And he was curator for the exhibition at the Adis Gallery Berlin and was the head curator for the fourth Gwangju Design Biennale 2011. So let's welcome Pai.
How do I open this? I'm not a Mac user, so do I just double click? Sorry. Hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me and for the kind introduction. I'll be talking about type through the diagram, and actually I was quite surprised that this issue was so important in in at least this context. And I'm going to talk about this relation through two different traditions, attitudes. I would prefer the term disciplinary formations. And so the first line of inquiry would be through the tradition of the École des Beaux-Arts and the way the Beaux-Arts trained its students and the way the the trained architects designed. The second line of inquiry would be the trajectory that began in the early 20th century, beginning from the studies through scientific management in the United States. And so this line of inquiry looks into the birth of the functional diagram. And of course, it's in the way that the functional diagram moves on to architecture during the early first half of the 20th century. And normally you would think that this latter tradition of functionalism, as it appears in the early 20th century, is opposed to this earlier 19th century tradition. And you would normally associate type with this kind of practice. And earlier Sam, of course, I think laid out brilliantly the kind of theoretical, historical basis that underlined the kind of practices represented by the French and American Beaux-Arts, and its influence, of course, was quite worldwide. But my argument eventually will end with the idea that these two traditions, in fact, converge, and that the typological traditions of the Beaux-Arts and the functionalist logic of the diagram as it moves on to architecture converge, and thus we have a new way of understanding not only the diagram but also potentially the type. And so I don't think we need to go too much into the specifics of what Beaux-Arts practice meant, particularly after the 19th century. We usually associate Beaux-Arts practice with historical models, as they are specifically laid out in the central courtyard of the École des Beaux-Arts. We associate this practice with mimetic practices, very specific ways of creating new designs through the study and analysis of previous norms. And we see this photograph of MIT students in the late 19th century conducting their exercises and practice as they look to base their new designs on previous historical models. But as actually Alan Colquhoun is mentioned often today, and I think Alan was very key in understanding that the 19th century Beaux-Arts was not the kind of endpoint of a old way of architecture, an older tradition, but in fact a revolutionary beginning for modern architecture. And I totally agree with that interpretation. And more specifically, in the way that Durang presented his didactical, as Sam mentioned, a proposition for architectural design. And since Sam has laid out Durang's ideas very succinctly, I will concentrate more and get your attention to look at the specific ways that Durang proposes students and architects work. And this plate was introduced by Sam, but I would like you to look at the lines that he proposes. These lines, which are diagrammatic organizations, are organized primarily through the axis. And if you look carefully, there are really two kinds of lines here. One is the central axis here, which is the basic sort of underlying order of the building. These are spatial axes. So the lines sort of go, enter through the center of the building. And then when you go to more details, and of course, Sam mentioned that Durang talked about how you begin with the whole and end with the detail. And so the other kinds of lines are also axes, but they go towards the center of the structure, to the walls and the columns. And so you have two different kinds of lines that form a diagram of this building. One is the spatial axis, and then you have the structural axis of the buildings. Now the introduction of the axis, of the central line, I think is the revolutionary part of Durang's proposal. I have argued in other places that it marks the moment where the subject enters architecture. And so the axis is a way for the architect to organize the space through a kind of subjective perception and cognition, or the way the subject sort of deals with the whole project. And if you compare this to Renaissance treatises where you see similar kinds of grids that organize the buildings, they're fundamentally different, because in this Cesariano drawing you see similar kinds of lines that he proposes as proportional mechanisms for organizing the building. They are actually outlines that define the outer surfaces and forms of the columns and walls. And so this idea, this older idea of order, of taxis, and if we use an Albertian, a Renaissance term, it's lineamenta. And so Alberti writes that all the intent and purpose of lineaments lies in finding the correct, infallible way of joining and fitting together those lines and angles which define and enclose the surface of the building. So the proportional lines that guided architecture, Western architecture until the 18th century, were actually sort of fixed lines that enclosed the outer forms of the building. And of course this implies that the forms and the elements that are used are fixed. Until the 18th century, you really can't imagine an architecture outside of classicism. But of course, into the 19th century, in Durang, you now have a system of a kind of order where you select pieces and elements. It can be Egyptian architecture, can be Gothic or classical, and then sort of place them in these sort of grids, which are basically, again, center lines. And the way that 19th century Beaux-Arts architects practice was based on these central spatial axes. And so from the way that you draw a caryatid to the way you organize a large complex building, the first thing is to organize the space through these spatial axes, and then you create a kind of a system of axes until you get into the details. And so the way you design a plan in this 19th century Beaux-Arts tradition, which extended until the first half of the 20th century, is you devise a system of center lines. And so you position your plan, you organize your plan, and the term of course is composition through these central spatial axes. And this kind of central line is very central to the way architects trained. You had to train to be able to go from this simple diagram to the specific figure forms. And so the central sort of discipline is to be able to go back and forth here. And from this very simple diagrams, you can sort of form very specifically the plan and elements and figures for your building. And so we saw this with Sam's presentation. And if you look carefully at each figure, it's sometimes difficult to understand, to sort out whether this line is a spatial central axis or the center line of the structure or wall or columns. And so sometimes you think that, okay, so this probably is a central spatial axis. Then maybe this is a double-loaded corridor. And so each instance is a bit different. And though Durang himself sort of explained the design process as a kind of step-by-step procedure, he also acknowledged that when you actually design, this all happens very quickly at one moment. And so that was the way that Beaux-Arts practice was taught and practiced. So it's a very hierarchical way of designing. You get the program, you think through it, and then with one sort of a gesture, of course it can take 12 hours or 1 hour, whatever, but in a sort of intuitive understanding of the whole program, and of course of the urban condition, you pull all these different kinds of axes together and create. And of course the plan was the fundamental basis of design. And so, for example, this sketch, which was obviously very quickly done, you can find perhaps the typological diagram, probably some kind of deviation from this. I think this had a kind of central axis, and you can see he is drawing the spatial axis, which in the end will not actually appear in the building. But in organizing his plan, this is of course ancestral, so he does this light sort of sketch here, and then some of these lines probably will be sort of at the end remain appear as actual structural walls. Some will have been axes that he drew into the plan, but of course they were just sort of like diagrammatic, in the end, non-material, non-visual interventions that helped him organize the whole thing. And so I think when we try to understand the notion of the diagrammatic construction of type, there is this sort of issue of what is actually visible and what is invisible, and that the relation between what you actually see, what you pay attention to, and what is sort of like a medium. And so the idea of medium enters into architecture with Durand, because these grids, these diagrams, act as a media for the subject to enter the project and enter into the actual, say, field of the site. And so I think it is an important problem and issue, particularly when you're trying to understand how you're going to deal with type in an actual project. What are you going to actually draw? What are you going to take out? How do you sort of manage instabilities during the whole process of the project? I think these sort of issues still remain quite important. Of course, this idea of the intervention of the subject and its presence and absence in the sequence of the project is a fundamentally modern idea, which was never really quite, I think, understood by the general architectural profession. And so in many cases, in the early 20th century, you obviously have bad Beaux-Arts practices. And mostly the reason is that they accept these typologies without understanding the principle of spatial composition, how the subject enters, and that he's free, and the architect is free to organize these things. And so you have, you see a lot of these manual sort of standardized ways of typological interpretations, which I think were the reasons for a lot of bad buildings. And obviously we all know that in the early 20th century that the Beaux-Arts practice, Beaux-Arts system falls down, it collapses. And when you study the process of why, you know, the Beaux-Arts tradition, which could be extended for 300 years, let's say, why that collapsed during the early 20th century, or how it collapsed, let's say, you can understand that the first thing that breaks down is the reliance on style. And already in Durand, you know, style becomes a secondary issue. He talks about how style is not important. And so with the milieu of the 20th century, which is very specific, I won't get into that. I think it's different from country to country. But the first thing that that gets under attack in the Beaux-Arts system is stylistic preference for historical styles. And so what happens in the early 20th century is that the Beaux-Arts system, the kind of spatial composition that was at the basis is somehow retained, but then you have to do away with all the styles and figures and classical elements. And what happens, and I argue, is you have what you might call the emaciated sketch. And so you have these sort of principles of organizing space without the basic elements that sustained it and made it a very dense analytical and analogical systems. And so you end up with a lot of these kinds of barren buildings. And what happens with architects is that without the kind of basic elements that were part of this system, you sort of get anxious. I think people sort of want expression, and so they start to sort of twist buildings and try to make different kinds of forms, or to use the term, mass becomes very important in providing expression in this kind of situation. And of course, we've thought about Le Corbusier and his importance. And of course, we know about the revolutionary instance that the 5 points, or more specifically, the domino grid, brings to modern architecture. And when you read Le Corbusier, he understands the traditions of the Beaux-Arts and how important the introduction of the axis is in the trajectory towards a modern architecture. And there's a very interesting part in towards an architecture where he discusses the Pompey house. And at that moment, he talks about how fundamental the axis is to architecture and to humanity. And so he retains the idea of the axis, and that he understands that it is through the axis that the subject intervenes into the world and into architecture. At the same time, we all know that this subject in Le Corbusier now sort of roams about, and so you can't really sort of set the subject as a fixed spatial center and then sort of organize the other elements into that center. Now we have this kind of gridded system, a kind of neutral, expansive, repetitive system, which he I think rightly called a desert. And so we have this kind of repetitive, neutral system where the subject, who is sort of at the center of the axis, now moves along and freely. And so the idea of the axis, I think Le Corbusier brings the idea of Durand's axis to its sort of logical conclusion. Now that if it's a spatial subject, then you don't have to confine that subject with these given elements, with this given kinds of structure of at least the 19th century. And so we understand the revolutionary ways that the grid system changed architecture. But at the same time, we have to remember that even Le Corbusier sort of relied on specific kinds of typological modes in designing particularly his early 1920s houses. And so you see these kinds of proportional diagrams that is his typology, is the way that he organized through the domino grid a kind of loose typological system in which the moving subject intervenes. Okay, so now we talked about the way the Beaux-Arts system was actually a fundamental modern phenomena, and that the important thing was that of the introduction of the spatial subject through the axis, and how Le Corbusier brings that into a new kind of disciplinary formation based on the repetitive grid. So we're now around the early 20th century. So now I begin to just talk briefly about the formation of the functional diagram, and I won't get into it too much, but the functional diagram historically begins, the modern functional diagram begins with the interventions of scientific management in the early 20th century. So this is a very American phenomenon that did spread out to Europe during the 1920s and 30s. And it begins with the urge to control labor and production. And so these diagrams were devised by early management engineers and what you call industrial engineers. And when you see these lines here in scientific management, they are usually representations of the workman or of products. And they developed extremely interesting ways of controlling the worker. And so you would have these kind of systems where you put a light spot on the top of the head or on the hand, and when this worker sort of is writing, probably a secretary writing a memo or something like that, how do you sort of make efficient the secretary's work? That's the kind of thing that we're doing. And so when you put a light spot here and then use high-speed photography, you end up with this diagram here. And through this diagram, you sort of train the worker to work efficiently and save a lot of money and time. And so the diagrams, the representation of the diagram was based on, in scientific management, on the control of the worker. So the diagram, the lines themselves actually represent either the person, the body, or the product, the way it moves around the office space. But when you look at the way that this functional diagram moves on to architecture, you quickly understand that in architecture, the lines that appear as diagrams are not actually, do not actually represent the body or the material. Actually, they are sort of like vague indications of spatial boundaries, let's say. And so you have these kinds of architectural research into functional spaces, but in fact what they're doing is sort of the lines are delineating spaces rather than the body or the material or the product within scientific management. And these kinds of research eventually end up into the new kinds of data and scientific research of the early 20th century. This kind of thing enters the architectural graphic standards, Neufeld, the Japanese data. They were all sort of produced during the 1930s. And so when you look at the architectural diagram as it sort of emerged through the influence of scientific management, actually they're not that dissimilar to the diagrams formulated by the Beaux-Arts, because the Beaux-Arts diagrams here are indications of, they're based on the spatial axis, so they're indications of how the space is organized. And that was actually the same role that the functional diagram had. And so we have this question about what the difference is between the typological diagrams that evolved out of the Beaux-Arts tradition and the functional diagram that comes out from a different path, but somehow at a certain point they look extremely similar. And so I will read from my book that was mentioned, The Portfolio and the Diagram. The question then becomes how one distinguishes the Beaux-Arts party diagram from the functionalist bubble diagram. As we have carefully examined, the distinction is not simply between form and non-form. Of course, when the functional diagram moves on to architecture, the primary idea is that we're not dealing with form, we're dealing with program, with functions, and we're sort of delaying the entry of form through a kind of logical process that the diagram administers. And so the idea here is that this is not form, while of course Beaux-Arts architects would say that this form is here. And so I would argue that the distinction is not simply between form and non-form. though the bubble diagram insists that it does not represent the physical building, it is in fact a loose configuration of the building, implying relations between volumetric units designated by verbal statements on movements and activities. And so the idea of the early functionalist diagram, I think that logic extends to most of the diagrammatic practice that we saw in the late 1990s. And I think Ben was in London yesterday or so, and so I thought, Möbius house would be a good example to show that actually recent diagrammatic practice actually follows the early functionalist diagrams of the early 20th century. And so, obviously I think Ben already knew what form he wanted to create and created this so-called diagram as the basis, what he called non-form actually. Okay. In the case of the party diagram here, these things, and we can also hark back to Durand. We may refer to Cartome de Gancy's famous definition of type, that it presents less the image of a thing to copy or imitate completely than the idea of an element which ought itself to serve as a rule for the model. Of course, this was already in Sam's presentation. And I would like you to focus on the idea of the statement of the idea of an element. In the case of the party diagram, we may refer to Gancy's famous definition of type here, and the proposition of the idea of an element is an understanding that the architectural element cannot be conceived in and of itself, but must be defined in relation to a larger whole. A column in relation to the entablature and base, a colonnade within a courtyard, a house within an urban fabric, and so on. And so the idea that the type implies relations is, I think, the central idea here. In other words, the Beaux-Arts party must also be understood as a system of relations, but one in which the transformation occur within the lines of its diagram. In the Beaux-Arts system, the diagram was embedded within the plan. That was why analysis and projection, abstraction and figuration could occur within the lines and surfaces of the portfolio. And so when we talked about the way that until the early 20th century, the way the diagram works is within the kind of plan figuration and within the structures of the material structures of the building. The initial sketch of the party diagram, the esquisse, the quick sketch, indicates the overall character of the design, the distribution of rooms, the details of its form, and the specifics of entrance, circulation, light, ventilation, and views. The Beaux-Arts plan was able to function as an analog because in using Nelson Goodman's terms, it was part of a syntactically dense and articulate system. And so once the commitment to style, to figures, to these elements collapses, then actually we have what I previously called the emaciated sketch, the emaciated esquisse. In the discourse of the diagram, so when the diagram appears, the analogical circle is untied and the diagram is dislodged from the dense hermetic system. But I won't be able to get into that part in this talk. But when the diagram appears, it brings with it together a whole different way of seeing other kinds of relations. And so within the Beaux-Arts system, you have a kind of dense conglomeration of images that you refer to, the norms that you look back to in your own design. With a diagram, now this is all dispersed. And so the way you sort of pull in different kinds of references, images, becomes dispersed, and there's a very specific sort of transition in the way that journals and books appear. And the data books, the Architect's Graphic Standards, Neufert, is just one sort of aspect of that. As noted, this was as much the consequence of the diagram's move toward the program as it was the result of the demise of the analytique that is the stylistic commitment. The discipline that facilitated the transformation of the esquisse into the final design, which was the analytic. Carrying little indication of the elevation, sections, and details, the bubble diagram no longer sustains the density of the esquisse. Okay. Finally, when we look at the relation between the diagram and the way that architectural form relation to it was assumed, when you look at the functional diagram, we realize that if a diagram can generate form, then it is already, the diagram is already a form. And the correlation to that diagram is form, is that form is a diagram. And so this is the important aspect when we understand the kind of transformations towards modern architecture. And of course, Le Corbusier understood this, that now that he's dealing with a kind of desert before he actually sort of begins his ambition, begins his work. And so in modern architecture, the diagram has become form, and form has become a diagram. Though these two propositions may seem one and the same, they imply quite different ways of approaching architectural design. In the former, that is, when diagram is a form, the architect's gaze remains centered on the line. And as we saw in the housing designs, I didn't mention, and we should pay heed to what Le Corbusier talked about this aspect when diagram becomes a form. Le Corbusier has characterized this kind of approach as the chimeric fixation on type plan, when the plan becomes a kind of fixed, sort of formulaic diagram. Le Corbusier knew that this fixation would result in the most barren of solutions, and thus he insisted that technology and standardization establish type elements, not the type plan. Stripped of its dense conventions, the type is no longer the central visual object of a tightly woven analogical system, but a loose diagrammatic configuration. And the last images I'm going to show is Sejima's work for Toledo Museum of Art. And I won't go into that, but I think during the late 90s, when the diagram was very much the attention of the architectural community, I think one of the best sort of characterization of what it means for form to be a diagram and what it means to work with a diagram was Toyo Ito's sort of characterization of Sejima's work. And so Toyo Ito tells us that Sejima has this sort of intuitive approach to the diagram, that she doesn't normally sort of go through that process where the diagram is considered non-form, and through a kind of planning and logical process, you end up with the final form. And so Toyo Ito states that Sejima understood that the diagram that she drew, of course, based on painstaking research and the assumptions of Japanese sophisticated construction and all those things. I think she does this because she has an assumption that the Building Institute will just sort of realize this work. And so in Sejima's case, she understands that form has already become a diagram, and so this gesture, this sort of drawing is both diagram and it's both form, and it becomes, of course, it coincides with this ambition, with this vision, coincidentally, and so it's not like that this diagram becomes this, but that she's able to conceive this as one thing. And so I will conclude with actually Giulio Carlo Argan's definition of type, which I didn't check, but it was, I think, in the early 1970s. And I think it still is very much relevant to our discussion today. To use Giulio Carlo Argan's expression, the type is a schema of spatial articulation devoid of value judgment. And so I'm not sure how. Actually, I have to look into this again. But he did understand that the instrumental nature of the diagram already of the type, and so that the type here, through in Argon's definition, is not the kind of sort of perhaps lost origin, but intended, I think, in line with Durand's interpretation, that this is a kind of instrument that we now have. To approach form as a diagram is to understand that when the analogical relation between diagram and plan is severed, when the discipline is dislocated from the lines, the gaze must move away from them. That is the simple yet difficult lesson of the dimensional type, a lesson that such seemingly disparate documents and plans, such as Le Corbusier's houses and the place of architectural graphic standards, tell us. What they are telling us in very different ways is that the discipline is no longer located within their lines, and that we are dealing with basically instrumental and without any fundamental value in them. But I don't really talk about that in the book itself. But when you look at Sejima, despite or together, not despite, I think together with the idea of the instrumentality of the diagram and instrumentality of form, there is this requirement, I think, to do relevant architecture, is to infuse these kind of instrumentalized forms with a kind of ambition, a kind of vision. Toyoto calls Sejima's interventions a kind of personal intuition, but I think there is much more than intuition going on in the way that these projects are realized. And so the whole social apparatus, the industrial complex, the technological basis, the kind of programmatic ambitions that these kind of projects come into the way that Sejima brings a certain vision and idea to this sort of instrumentalized desert of the diagram. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all the great presentation by Sam, Larry, and Hyungmin. And now we are glad to take some questions from the room about all three presentations.
Maybe I'll try this one, yeah.
Which is fine.
Have a new one.
Yeah, I wonder when the three of you are speaking, in fact, whether you're talking about the same kind of diagram or not, because it seems that at a certain moment, there was an idea of a kind of social diagram, and then a diagram is something that could be graphically represented. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the different uses of the diagram, because it's something that you both concluded with, and that you elaborated on, I think, quite a lot. So that's my question.
Yeah, I suppose that's probably directed at me because I, talk about people who go to work and people sleeping in chairs, and it doesn't sound like it's the same sort of diagram that that Hyungmin is referring to. But in fact, what I mean to indicate is that there's already a social pattern implied in the walls, and there's a way of I think Hyungmin's first point about capturing both the understanding of space from a subject position as well as the constructibility of things has always been infused with this sense of active and sleeping bodies. Now. I think that what I'm trying to get at also, though, is that, and we didn't have a chance to discuss it, but to imagine that these things are discursively organized, I don't think we actually concern ourselves so much with the form of that sleeping body. It doesn't get quite, it's not detailed in the same way. There are other kinds of arguments depending upon which discursive formation we're talking about. So I think there are several points that I think were really essential in Hyungmin's presentation and in his book. And these are not only that that form is already present in the so-called 20th century functional diagram. I think that's absolutely critical. And that furthermore, there's already a diagram or a kind of force that is there in the description of form through drawings. But also beyond that, there is a kind of relationship between the disciplinarity of architecture and something else, which is a discursive formation. And the diagram, to me, I think in a way belongs more in the discursive formation, and the type belongs more in architecture, but the two entangle.
I think that we often make the mistake of approaching the issue of the diagram solely on the figure itself. And so when you look at the figure, I think you can sort of analyze how these diagrams are different. But I think when we talk about the diagram in a more expansive way, that we have to understand that the diagram is part of a larger discursive formation where it's part of many different sort of changes in the way we look at things and the way we interpret things. So I think rather than concentrate on the way a specific figure is different, I think it has to be approached as a larger formation of how that sort of, let's say, figure, if it is the central sort of point of concern, sort of configures relations. It can be societal, it can be formal, it can be technological. And so I think I have a sentence in my book that the diagram is the symptom, is the quintessential symptom of the discourse of the diagram. And so when we talk about the diagram, we need to sort of understand it as part of a larger sort of configuration of both social and architectural elements and forces.
I'd like to thank you. I indeed enjoyed all the presentations, and they seem to me that they have left many issues to be discussed. The very first thing that I would like to say is that types, in my view, resist representations. I don't believe that types can be drawn, that can be said, that is a type. And almost as a result of that, I think that using Durand to speak about typology, I would say that this is misleading. In my view, the plan that you have shown with the axis and the big central space and say, this is a building that is drawn by the idea of a diagram, I wouldn't say that there is anything diagrammatic. At the end, diagram has to do much more with description of movement, with the disposition of functions, and then you are able of just locating that in the space and saying, I would be able to translate directly into the building, but it's much more valuable when Rinkul didn't explain the diagram of the athletic building in New York. He says what's happened in this building, but he's not just saying that the building is going to be structured through a diagram. It's quite, therefore, in my view, you're able to describe which is the movement of some production, but you are unable to translate that directly in the building, or this seems to me misleading. Even when you are taking the Sanas building and you look at you are able to follow some contiguities that doesn't happen to be in the building exactly the same you have shown in the diagram. In the building is indeed the courtyards are taking much more protagonism and they are structuring. Then the architectural operation is just the location of the courtyards and how those courtyards are going to assume the system of contiguities that could be, let's let's say, put together in the diagram. Indeed, I believe that when the quote you have done of Kibnis by saying diagrams underline all typological theory, all typological theories, I wouldn't say that at the end any type is just able to be represented or being drawn. That at the end, you identify the types in the things that has been built, but it would be difficult to say that the buildings are serving to some of those diagrams. I think that is misleading also to offer all the geometrical, let's say, figures by Durand and say that those are diagrams of buildings. When you have shown the drawings of Hahnemann, that is just the contrary of what the diagram is,
Yes,
in
yes.
my view.
Uh,
Therefore, I think that we should try to clarify. Obviously, I believe that the notion of type underlies a lot of architecture, but it's very difficult to translate that, and therefore it's such a slippery and a fuzzy concept.
Mm.
Anyway.
I mean, perhaps if I could comment on this, I think I think, of course, you're on one hand you're completely correct, right? Because we also know that Durand in many ways precedes even historiographically Quatremer. But I think the reason why to think this together to me is, well, I tried to kind of explain it with Leroy, because I think that in a way Leroy is the forefather of two ideas, or he's symptomatic, I think, for a certain kind of problem that gets discussed. And I think that on the one hand, it gets articulated in the theories of Quatremer, on sort of much more explicitly on the idea of type. On the other hand, of course, it leads to someone like Durand, which I think is a very different tradition, right? I think it has nothing to do with the kind of art historical discourse or the question of knowledge that I think Quatremer talks about. It is actually, in fact, I think, what we would probably now call sort of a much more diagrammatic tradition that has to do with drawing, right? How do we draw things? How do we conceptualize these things? But sure, I think you are correct, it's misleading. But of course, that's also in a way why, I guess it's just kind of acknowledging also that I think today, when the majority, when we talk about types, people talk about building typologies, right? So, of course, the closest is Durand, even though he doesn't talk about building typologies. In fact, he talks about genres that come out from the idea of character, right? So there's a complication. But I think to come back to the point, right, I thought to me the sort of interesting part was when the idea of history and theory comes together, right? And I think it both is about how do we conceptualize the knowledge, but also how do we actually start to kind of draw it, right? And I think this is why the idea of type or the sort of diagram, how it was used by Leroy and then of course by Durand and you know everyone following up from that, I think is very, very instrumental. Now, of course, you're completely right. That doesn't mean they've drawn types, right? But I think they've actually a part, in a way, I guess, of the problem, right? How do you conceptualize it, or how do you actually translate it?
If I maybe if I could go on slightly from that, we play a funny game in one of my courses, and it's you know, an image comes up and we say, "Is it a diagram?" And then of course, you know, we're all, you know, all of us, we kind of, you know, collapse in various levels of doubt as soon as we encounter the question. Now, I completely agree with you about the table that was put up, Hyungmin's table. And in the sense, what we finally decided is we like to call it a table of form and organizational a description of form, organization, relationships preparatory to being able to talk about diagrams and types, and so in a sense it's something that you might think you kind of have to digest in the 19th century if you were ever going to go on and try to diagram things or sketch things or analyze things. All the things that you have to do in a way are indicated in the table, but it's clearly not a diagram nor a set of diagrams. But coming to your other point, yes, I think one of the things we share is the sense that type is a synthesis, but what precisely it's a synthesis of is always remains, I think, somewhat open to question. So,
but I have been attracted when I wonder whether I understood properly what you said. But when we watch at all those inner spaces in the latest part of your presentation, and you say all those spaces are the way we feel nowadays that the lobby of a public space should be. And yet it would be completely impossible in this very moment to say that you are talking about a type and that you are talking about a very specific space type that is extended everywhere nowadays. And then we are almost unable to identify that as a type. And yet it is a type of a space, as it was the entrances to the skyscraper lobbies in New York in the 50s and 60s. That is a sense, with those states, you have shown 4 or 5 or 6 examples of that quite clear. And yet, I guess that you would agree with me that it's very difficult to say and to grasp and to express graphically what means this space.
Absolutely.
And yet, at the end, we will, when talking about type, and I wouldn't to anticipate something of what I would like to say this afternoon, but at the end, you identify what has been the past throughout some types. Should it happen again, or the same, in the time to come, when looking at what for us is so evasive nowadays, they will be able to identify and say, well, in the early 21st century, they thought the spaces this way, because at this point of view, the way in which Seattle Library dissolves the idea of, let's say, an ideal public library, that came from those examples we have seen as well, is very representative. It represents quite well the true resistance to recognize ourselves in any style nowadays. Well, then I would like just comments without clear proposal.
The way I would sort of set this discussion or the kind of connection between our 3 presentation is that my interests have been on disciplinary processes, and while I think Larry was concerned with the effects in a very expanded meaning of that term, interpretation, meaning, and effect. And I think one of the primary sort of issues nowadays is how these 2 things relate. And so for the disciplinary concerns, I think you can go down to little things like what do you actually draw? And for me, when you actually draw something in a specific figure, it means that you're committing to that. You're making value judgments about certain things, however the logic appears. And so the issue about what you actually draw and do not draw within perhaps a kind of larger synthetic idea of type seems to me a very crucial issue. And then we have to think, if I draw this, what will happen when the building actually is built up and people occupy it and the effects that it creates. And so I think for mature architects who do interesting work, they've made this sort of decision of how they're going to connect these 2 things. Whereas I think people who are searching for different issues, I think it's a very difficult problem about what you commit to in a kind of system, whether you call it type or not. And so the issue about what is drawn and not drawn can be very fundamental. And if you believe that there are certain sort of types that cannot be drawn, then you have to find a way to as an architect, to create that. But I have difficulty imagining, without actually representing it, how you're actually going to sort of argue or attain a kind of effect that can be very fundamental or original
Well,
or primordial.
I think in some way to follow on from the intersection there, I think it's very difficult to imagine the becoming typical of the Seattle Public Library from this moment. That is, as we treat it prospectively, I can see all the reasons, as you've picked up, I can see all the reasons why characteristics of it seem to be in keeping with things that we may want to see under certain configurations, economic and social and urban today. At the same time, if I try to imagine who would set about drawing the next version and the next version and the next version and creating the series that one might imagine could begin to describe an approach towards type. I mean, obviously, it's not a typical building now. It has precedent, and there is, at the heart of it, a series of considerations within the discipline that have guided how we look at its possibility. And yet, it doesn't all come together yet as something that we could describe as a type. There is no synthesis there where we'd say, yep, okay, that's it, I've got it. And so I think in a way this question that Hyungmin is raising, how do we go from this moment to begin to extract from it the things that we would be committed to as distinctive the next time, is a very interesting challenge, I think.
Can I ask you something that seems to me rather paradoxical and contradictory about Durand? That the justification, as I understand it, in his lectures for this new method of composition is that the inherited forms from the ancient world, the palazzo and the temple and the basilica and so on, are insufficient for this range of new institutions and new societal forms and industrial forms forms of activity, that is, that we find in the late 18th, 19th century. And yet when you come to his method of composition, it is, people have said, it is essentially a method of formal composition. And I think I'm right in saying that nowhere does he talk about the process where programs and functions are mapped onto these symmetrical forms, which is kind of strange. I think you indicated that this is something that happens when the Beaux-Arts architect who's got all this apparatus comes to the drawing board and does it all. But he doesn't talk about that, I think, despite the fact that in the Recueil he explicitly sets out types that are classified in terms of use and activity. But those are not brought to bear. I wondered whether, I've been interested a lot in biological analogies, and I think you mentioned, Sam, that the possibility, and I think it's almost certainty, that Durand and others were inspired by contemporary activities in natural history, in Buffon and Cuvier and so on. But that natural history is at that stage really descriptive and is to quite a large extent formal, and it is awaiting the kind of physiology and anatomy that comes in later in the 19th century. And I wonder whether that's what Durand is drawing and is arriving at this kind of formal system, which seems to have this disjunction from program and activity and institution. Is that?
I think what it relates to is that I think you're correct to say that the employment of all these drawings and these taxonomies are descriptive. But of course, it's also the kind of tipping point when it turns into something else, right? And I think that's kind of, in some ways, it's a recognition, I think, also by all these architects to say, that kind of descriptive method actually allows us to talk about architecture in a very different way. Whereas before, it was, of course, much more driven by the question of archaeology, but at least in the 17th, 18th century. So what you get is a different kind of method of description, right? So in fact, it's a description that is, in the one way, I guess what's the most critical is it turns away from looking backwards to the past and sort of archaeology purely, to actually something that looks at in terms of what will happen, right? Of course, it's not quite there yet, right, in many ways, because we know in the 19th century, 18th century, what happens. Evolutionary theory as such doesn't exist as we know it today. But of course, they're the beginnings, right? And I think you also, why, of course, this kind of whole discourse, I think, with Cuvier and so on becomes so important, not just for, I think, zoologists, is because there was this sort of belief that this discourse of these origins would in fact reflect back on a societal problem, right? I mean, looking back and understanding what the past is, we will understand actually where we should be as a modern society. And I think that belief, I think also, well, I think this is where it goes beyond the descriptive, right? And I think this is also why there's this kind of belief also with Durand that to mobilize drawings in a different way will actually reveal something else about form. Now, having said that, I think it's also correct to say that Durand, I think, never set this whole thing up to make architects inventive. It was set up, in fact, to teach engineers how to execute very basic buildings. And I think this is, in a way, I think, the kind of tragedy, I think, today, that we actually refer back to someone like Durand and the process and think that was actually a solution that was meant to teach us how to be inventive. It was never like that, right? But I mean, so what I was trying to say is one important thing it did is it actually gave us a different kind of tools or different understanding of how to analyze architecture. Now, there are, of course, certain limitations to that, right? But I think that has become then a very rich tradition that led into different ideas of the diagrams, right? And I think this is where I see kind of the potential of that, right? And, yeah.
I think this won't be an answer to your question, but within the limited sort of boundaries of the Beaux-Arts tradition, we have certain ideas about the relation between program and design and composition, let's say. And so that in the Beaux-Arts tradition, architecture was never seen as a result of the program. And so that architecture was, particularly in the late, after the line, it was sort of seen as a formal mechanism and a solution to the program, but that the architect was never burdened or responsible for the program. And so the idea that architecture comes out of the program was totally alien to that tradition. And so they talk about elegance of solutions to different programs. And so even Durand, I think, within that milieu, did not have the kind of programmatic sort of interest that we now always have.
But in the end, these structures are filled with people and activities and institutions somehow.
Yeah. So there is there are, I think, historically we do need to understand that how they sort of approached social issues. I have concentrated on these formal mechanisms, but I think there's this whole area of interest, of historical and theoretical interest.
I have a question. I think that the Seattle Library opens a quite interesting question in relation to the convention and the conventional, right? I mean, the conventional, as for example, all these libraries that you showed before. So in that sense, is it possible to challenge the problem of conventions through typological reasoning? So in one sense, typology seems a kind of heavy dress in terms of how history is coming again and again, and on the other hand, you see like the tool of the diagram as a much more free instrument to operate in cases like, I think, this library. So I don't know what's your general opinion.
Yeah, okay. Oh, good. Well, I guess that's, let's say, the larger question. Does type potentially contest convention? Yeah, actually. I think the reason why it does, I guess, from my point of view, the best way to understand type is not as the repetition of the same, but as the repetition of difference. So what you're really trying to identify when you try to capture the idea that is apparently in type is, what is it that makes it distinctive? What is it that allows one to see a force that veers away from something else? And so for me, type, in a way, is always trying to capture that distinctiveness that pushes towards alteration, variation. Now, every once in a while, it seems that instead of just a series where things all share a kind of family resemblance, it seems to me that something kind of dramatic happens. Now, in the case of the Seattle Public Library, as I understand it, the exploration of form and organization going on inside of OMA wasn't necessarily, focused on the question all along, can we make a better library? Instead, there's an exploration of form and organization that is independent of that question, but it turns out it can be applied to questions of light, information, the absorption of a public in a certain kind of civic building, a whole series of other questions. You suddenly go, hang on, the way we're seeing the stabilities and instabilities in a program allow us to deploy a set of ideas that we've been working on materially for quite a long time, and also starting to think about it in relation to a range of other library projects, and finally you get a chance to build it. And then it becomes something that where it begins to challenge the convention. Now, I would expect that the things that are learned from the Seattle Public Library would begin to inform library design at the very least. But it hasn't overturned all the libraries that are, the design of all the libraries we're seeing now. Recently was in the new library in Amsterdam. What a mess. It doesn't seem to have learned very much at all from the problems of, light, organization, that in a way you would start thinking about after looking at the Seattle Public Library. And not to mention the question of, that I was trying to get at is can the organizational principles through the discipline start to become indicative of directions for other genres like workspace and so on. We didn't really get into the depth of that, but I think in both cases the point that I'm trying to suggest is that there are antecedents to that building that can only be thought about if you question the fundamental basis, not of libraries, but of organizational specificities at the heart of type. And it's the questioning of those organizational specificities that seems to me to lead to a veering away from convention.
I'll just briefly sort of take the question to a different sort of line, and is that your question seems to assume that conventions are a sort of a negative thing that you have to overcome or critique?
No, I'm saying that
okay.
I mean, of course, it's really hard to work with something without any convention, I think. But at the same time, sometimes, like I don't know, in the case of the library, it looks much more straightforward to break these conventions through the diagram.
Mm-hmm. I'm taking this to a totally different sort of issue, but I think we do have to sort of point it out because I'm from a kind of different situation. I think there was extremely interesting discussion in the 80s, I think 70s, about the relation with type, tradition, and convention. And so, and there's a kind of specific Western configuration in the relation between the three. But then when we deal with certain situations, particularly where I'm from or where China is at now, is that there is a kind of schism in this sort of tradition and type. And so a lot of times in those cases, we rely on convention rather than a broken tradition. And so when you say, when the institution of the modern library hasn't been established, and it's sort of still evolving and a lot of things are, you have to build a library in Beijing or in Seoul, then you do have to rely on conventions rather than traditions. And then you don't have the Western typologies that operate, and so you have to create new kinds of, I'm not sure whether we would call that type in that kind of situation, actually.
No, but talking about it's extremely interesting to speak about the two libraries of Renkulhas, the France library and Seattle, because I would say that are quite different. I guess that it was much more a certain typological interest in the France library than in this one. In France, he wanted to give how, let's say, a national library should be. And then there is a clear effort for this ambition, innovation on that. I would say that the Seattle library, in my view, the building speaks more about what the architect knows of how to build a building than just a specific library. At the end, it is more something about the entire site conditions, how he proceeds, and you could say at the end that the Seattle library could be whatever kind of a public building. It could be used in whatever. Paradoxically, at the end, some of the images that you see of the library have the greatness and even the monumentality of all libraries as well. And falls in a rhetoric that probably wouldn't like to Renkulhas to speak about. Instead, the building is a clear statement of how he has mastered a certain way of dealing with how to put the building in the middle of the city. But the fact that we are talking about type has entered in a rather deceptive way. The discussion whether Seattle Library is establishing the path for the new type of contemporary buildings. I guess it doesn't. It's something else. What value it does.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Are there any questions, maybe? No. Okay. I think then we'll break and we start again at 2 o'clock. So please open back.
Mary, we have met before around MIT. I think no. If I of course I know your face.
Yeah, well, the same.